European colonialism intentionally created divides over almost the entire landmass of the earth, creating new countries from lands that were taken, as well as divisions and discords between peoples that originally existed in harmony. It also diagrams the means by which power and control were consolidated worldwide, mostly starting out as trading companies that ended up being very powerful in their respective regions, and after gaining complete control, transferring power and control of the regions to their respective European empires. This is the first part of a three-part series in which I will be providing numerous examples to illustrate how creating the New World from the Old World was accomplished. Other means by which power and control were consolidated included partitions, wars, conferences, and treaties. I will be providing these examples I have found in traveling the cities and places that are in alignment with each other around the earth, and in many cases what happened involved all of these means. My name is Michelle Gibson. I will start with trading companies. The British East India Company held a monopoly granted to it by Queen Elizabeth I of England in 1600 between South Africa's Cape of Good Hope and Tierra del Fuego's Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America until 1834, when the monopoly was lost. East Indiaman was the general name of any sailing ship operating under charter or license to any of the East India Companies of the major European trading powers of the 17th through 19th centuries. The British East India Company ruled over parts of the Indian subcontinent between 1757 and 1858, commencing after the 1757 Battle of Plassey, called a decisive victory over the Nawab of Bengal, Mir Jafar, after which time the Nawab ceded revenues to what was called the Company. Mir Jafar was considered the first dependent Nawab of Bengal of the British East India Company, and this was considered to be the start of British imperialism in India, and a key step in the eventual British domination of vast areas there. The British East India Company arrived in Madras in 1600, making it their principal settlement, and, we are told, constructed Fort St. George in 1644. The British East India Company was said to have come here in order to have a port close to the Malaccan Straits, the main shipping channel between the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean, and to secure its trade lines and commercial interests in the spice trade. It is one of the most important shipping lanes in the world. They succeeded in securing their goals, as the British East India Company obtained the Prince of Wales Island in the Malaccan Strait. Prince of Wales Island is known today as Penang Island, the main constituent island of the Malaysian state of Penang. Apparently, the British East India Company was able to successfully take what they named the Prince of Wales Island from the Kedah Sultanate in 1786, which became the capital of the Straits Settlements, a group of British territories in Southeast Asia established in 1826, including Malacca and Singapore. The Kedah Sultanate was an historical Muslim dynasty located in the Malay Peninsula, said to have dated as an independent state from 1136 AD. Its monarchy was abolished with the formation of the Malayan Union in 1909, but restored and added to the Federation of Malaya in 1963. The Madras Presidency, or the Presidency of Fort St. George, was an administrative subdivision of British India and established in 1652, and of which Elihu Yale became president in 1684. Elihu Yale was a British merchant, trader, and a president of the British East India Company settlement at Fort St. George, who later became a benefactor of the collegiate school in the colony of Connecticut, which in 1718 was renamed Yale College in his honor. At its greatest extent, the Madras Presidency included most of southern India, including the whole of the states of Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh, parts of Odisha, Kerala, and Karnataka, and the Union Territory of Lakshadweep, a group of islands off India's southwestern coast. The Madras Presidency ended with the advent of Indian independence on August 15th of 1947. Bareilly in northern India was a center of the ultimately unsuccessful Indian Rebellion of 1857. At this time, a major uprising took place in northern India, which lasted between 1857 and 1859, around the rule of the British East India Company, which functioned as a sovereign power on behalf of the British Crown. The last Mughal emperor in India, Bahadur Shah Zafar, a devout Sufi, a mystic and practitioner of the inward dimension of Islam, was deposed by the British East India Company in 1858 and exiled to Rangoon in Burma. Through the Government of India Act of 1858, the British Crown assumed direct control of the British East India Company held territories in India in the form of the new British Raj. And in 1876, Queen Victoria assumed the title of Empress of India. King Emperor and Queen Empress were the titles used by the British monarchs in India between 1876 and 1948. The tribe of Bil Minas inhabits all three islands on Debar Lake near Udaipur in India. The Bils, who speak a subgroup of the western zone of the Indo-Aryan languages, are one of the largest indigenous groups in India, as well as among the most economically deprived peoples of India. This is interesting to note because they are among the oldest communities in India and were inhabitants of the ancient Indus River Valley civilization. The Bil Minas tribe was the ruling tribe before the Kuchhawaha clan of Rajputs, otherwise known as the Mewar Kingdom, forced them to hide out in the Aravalli Hills, and they were named a criminal tribe by the British government in 1924 to keep them from regaining power over the Rajputs. They were subsequently given protection as a scheduled tribe after the upliftment in 1949 of the Criminal Tribe Act, which had been enacted on October 12 of 1871. The Criminal Tribe Act of 1871 criminalized entire communities by designating them as habitual criminals, and restrictions on their movements imposed, including men having to report to the police once per week. A scheduled tribe is recognized by the Indian Constitution, have political representation, and yet they are legally totally and partially excluded from various types of services important for leading a healthy life, and altogether, the scheduled tribes of India make up almost 10% of the population and are considered India's poorest people. India was called the jewel in the crown of the British Empire and its largest and most important overseas possession. Much of the British Empire was built around India in order to provide routes to or protection for India. India was prosperous and rich in spices, silk, indigo, gold, cotton, and other products and resources. Trade with and eventual political dominance of large parts of India was what provided Britain with large parts of its wealth in the 1700s through the 1900s. On March 20th of 1602, the Dutch East India Company was chartered to trade with India and Southeast Asian countries when the Dutch government granted it a 21-year monopoly for the Dutch spice trade. It was a megacorporation, which is defined as a massive conglomerate, usually private, holding near monopolistic, if not monopolistic, control over multiple markets. It was chartered to trade with Mughal India, and primarily Mughal Bengal, from where 50% of textiles and 80% of silks were imported. It has often been labeled a trading or shipping company, but was in fact a proto-conglomerate diversifying into multiple commercial and industrial activities, such as international trade, shipbuilding, production and trade of East Indian spices, Indonesian coffee, Formosan, which is Taiwanese, sugarcane, and South African wine. The first formally listed public company by widely issuing shares of stock and bonds to the general public in the early 1600s. It was the world's most valuable company of all time, with a worth of $7.9 trillion. It is considered by many to have been the forerunner of modern corporations. I have encountered the Dutch East India Company in tracking our alignments in places like Tristan da Cunha, by a Dutch East Indiaman ship in February of 1643, a small island favorably located on the world's historic shipping lanes between the west and the east, and the Dutch made 4 more stops there in the next 25 years, making the first rough charts of the islands in 1656. Tristan da Cunha is on an alignment that goes through Sri Lanka and India, and in the present day is considered a constituent part of the British Overseas Territory of the South Atlantic. The islands of Tristan da Cunha were annexed by the United Kingdom in 1816, making them a dependency of the Cape Colony in South Africa, for the stated reasons of preventing the island's use as a base for any attempt to free Napoleon Bonaparte from his prison on St. Helena, and for preventing the United States from using the islands as a base for naval cruisers. While possession was abandoned by the United Kingdom in 1817, a garrison of British Marines stayed and formed the nucleus of a permanent population, which gradually grew, and was once a stopping point for lengthy sea voyages until the time of the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. I also found the Dutch East India Company in Cape Town, South Africa, where they established the first European settlement in South Africa there in 1652, called the VOC Cape Colony. In 1814, it became the British Cape Colony, as it was ceded to the British Crown by the Netherlands after the British successfully invaded and took over everything from the Dutch starting in 1806. South Africa is the world's leading producer of copper, platinum, uranium, and vanadium. I found the Dutch East India Company in other places and will be talking about more examples with regards to colonization in Part 2. These were 2 major players of a number of trading companies during that era. Others included the French East India Company, founded in 1661 to compete with first the British and later the Dutch East India Companies in the East Indies, the term given to the lands of South and Southeast Asia. It was chartered by King Louis XIV for the purpose of trading in the Eastern Hemisphere, and was abolished in 1769 because it was said to have not been able to maintain itself financially. The Swedish South Company was founded in 1626 to support trade between Sweden and its colonies New Sweden. The company established a settlement at Fort Christina, named after Queen Christina of Sweden, and is present-day Wilmington, Delaware. Said to have been built in 1638, the first Swedish settlement in North America, and the principal settlement of the New Sweden colony. The activities of the Swedish South Company were finally dissolved in 1680, after New Sweden was annexed by New Netherlands in 1655. The Hudson Bay Company was granted a permanent charter by King Charles II of England on May 2nd of 1670, conferring 2 things on a group of French explorers. 1, a trading monopoly with London merchants over the lucrative North American fur trade, and 2, gave them effective control over the vast region surrounding the Hudson Bay in Canada. It is still in operation today as a Canadian retail business group operating department stores in several countries. The British Northwest Company, a fur trading business based out of Montreal and Quebec from 1779 to 1821, built their inland headquarters at Grand Portage in Minnesota in 1785, and was active there until 1802. Grand Portage, along with Fort Niagara, Fort Detroit, and Michilimackinac in the Straits of Mackinac in Michigan, were the main fur trading centers of the British Empire in North America. The Royal Company of the Philippines was established by the royal decree of King Charles III of Spain, and had a monopoly on the trading industry between Spain and the Philippines, and to exploit the natural resources of the islands. It also opened a large access to goods from the Orient that were imported into the Philippines. The next subject I would like to introduce is that of partition, and what that actually looked like in real life. Partition is defined as a change of political borders, cutting through at least one territory considered a homeland by some community. Here are some examples I encountered, all of them along the same alignment I was tracking. Another one of the 3 presidencies of British India within the British Empire was the Bengal Presidency, which was formed following the dissolution of Mughal Bengal in 1757. The Bengal Presidency was the economic, cultural, and educational hub of the British Raj, and its governor was concurrently the Viceroy of India for many years. In 1905, Bengal proper was partitioned, separating largely Muslim areas from largely Hindu areas. In 1912, British India was reorganized, and the Bengal Presidency was reunited with a single Bengali-speaking province. Could this first partitioning of Bengal have been a human and social engineering project and a practice run for the 1947 boundary partition of India, where Bengal, primarily in the form of Bangladesh, and India into West Pakistan and East Pakistan. The 1947 boundary partition divided what was British India into two independent Dominion states, the Union of India and the Dominion of Pakistan. Today, they are called the Republic of India and the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. It involved the division of two provinces, Punjab and Bengal, based on district-wise non-Muslim or Muslim majorities, and resulted in the dissolution of the British Raj. The partition of India in 1947 divided British India into the Union of India and the Dominion of Pakistan along religious lines, displacing 10 to 12 million people and creating overwhelming refugee crises in the newly constituted dominions, as well as large-scale violence. This created the conditions for suspicion and hostility between these two countries into the present day. After India gained independence in 1947, the Nizam of Hyderabad, Mir Osman Ali Khan, the world's richest man of his time, declared his intention to remain independent rather than become part of the Indian Union. The Hyderabad State Congress began to agitate against him, with the support of the Indian National Congress and Communist Party of India, and in 1948, the Indian Army invaded Hyderabad, and he ended up surrendering to the Indian Union, signing an instrument of accession, which made him a princely governor of Hyderabad until October 31st of 1956. Then, on November 1st of 1956, Hyderabad was split into three parts and merged into neighboring states. Eventually, the Telangana state, of which Hyderabad is the capital, was formed on June 2nd of 2014. The Pashtuns are the primary inhabitants of a region in Pakistan and in Afghanistan, in a region regarded as Pashtunistan, split between two countries since the Durand Line border between the two countries was formed in 1893 after the Second Anglo-Afghan War. The namesake of the line, Sir Henry Mortimer Durand, was a British diplomat and civil servant of the British Raj. We are told that together with the Afghan Emir, Abdur Rahman Khan, it was established to fix the limit of their respective spheres of influence and improve diplomatic relations and trade. Well, that certainly sounds good. But what was really going on here? The Durand Line cuts through the Pashtunistan and Balochistan regions, politically dividing ethnic Pashtuns and Baloch, who live on both sides of the border. What was the actual purpose of dividing a people in this fashion? The Pashtun are a tribal nation of millions of Afghani and Pakistani Muslims, who also have a strong oral tradition that they are descendants of lost 10 tribes of Israel, and they refer to themselves as Bani Israel. Here is an example of a Pashtun textile piece showing the sacred geometric shape of a star tetrahedron in the center, also known as the Star of David, and a recognizable symbol of what is called Judaism today, as seen on the flag of Israel. On the same alignment that I found the Pashtun, I found Khorasan, a province in northeastern Iran from 1906 to 2004, but historically referred to a much larger area comprising the east and northeast of the Persian Empire, including, besides northeastern Iran, parts of Afghanistan and much of Central Asia. While Khorasan is said to mean the eastern province, it is also said to mean the land of the sun. During the Kahar dynasty and empire of what was then called the Sublime State of Persia between 1789 and 1925, Britain supported the Afghans to protect their East India Company. Herat in Afghanistan was separated from Persia by the British in the Anglo-Persian War of 1856 to 1857, and the Persians were unable to defeat the British to take back Herat. Persia was compelled by the Treaty of Paris of 1857 not to challenge the British for Herat and other parts of what is today Afghanistan. Khorasan was divided into two parts in 1906, with the eastern part coming under British occupation and the western section remaining part of Persia, shown here. Another example was the Ottoman Empire, founded at the end of the 13th century in northwestern Anatolia, and existing as a vast empire and center of interactions between East and West until the end of World War I, when it was defeated as an ally of Germany and occupied by Allied forces. At this time, the Ottoman Empire was partitioned and lost its Middle East holdings, which were divided between the Allied forces. Then there is what happened to historical Armenia, much of which today is part of Turkey. There was a time when Armenia was considered the center of the world, as depicted in this map. The Sumerians called Ararat Arata, and they tell of this land, of their ancestors, in the Armenian highlands, in the epic poem of Gilgamesh. At the end of World War I, when the victorious powers divided up the Ottoman Empire, the 1920 Treaty of Sevres promised to maintain the existence of the Armenian Republic and to attach the former territories of Ottoman Armenia to it. Ottoman Armenia was referred to as Wilsonian Armenia because the new borders were to be drawn by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. The Treaty of Sevres never came into effect because it was rejected by the Turkish national movement, which used the occasion to declare itself as the rightful government of Turkey. And Turkish nationalist forces invaded Armenia in 1920 from the east, ultimately forcing most of the Armenian military forces to disarm, cede back the former Ottoman lands granted to Armenia by the treaty, and to give up Wilsonian Armenia. And during the same time frame, the Soviet 11th Army invaded Armenia and ultimately took complete control of the rest of it, what became Soviet Armenia in 1921. Thus, the Turkish War of Independence, initiated under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk against the occupying powers, resulted in the abolition of the monarchy in 1922 and the establishment of the Republic of Turkey in 1923. Ataturk was the first president of the new republic, moving the country's seat of power from Istanbul to Ankara. Obviously, this region of historical Armenia was highly prized, and its people were persecuted, and many were killed. The next area I am going to look into specifically are wars themselves. It is noteworthy to me there are so many military engagements historically that have taken place along these alignments I have been tracking, which include, but aren't limited to, the Napoleonic Wars, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, among many others. It makes me wonder what they were really all about with regards to the ancient advanced Moorish civilization and the Earth's energy grid system. I find it really interesting that General Charles Cornwallis, famous for being defeated at and surrendering after the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, ending the American Revolutionary War, apparently was rewarded with knighthood in 1786, and in the same year became Governor-General and Commander-in-Chief of the British colony in India. He commanded the army that successfully stormed Nanjing in 1791, an ancient hilltop fortress in Karnataka state that was at one time believed to have been impregnable. This was during the Third Anglo-Mysore War, a conflict in South India between the British East India Company and the Kingdom of Mysore. Here are some examples I found from the time of the Napoleonic Wars and Empire. The French invasion of Malta in 1798, led by Napoleon himself, was part of the Mediterranean campaign in the War of the Second Coalition of the French Revolutionary Wars. The Order of the Knights Hospitallers, the rulers of Malta since 1530, surrendered to Napoleon when the French landed there. The island country of Malta is located in the Mediterranean Sea between Sicily and Tunisia. We are told that during the short time Napoleon was in the capital city, Valletta, between June 12th and 18th of 1798, he reformed, among other things, national administration with the creation of a government commission and 12 municipalities, a public finance administration, and the organization of public education, providing for primary and secondary education. All this before sailing for Egypt and leaving a substantial garrison in Malta. Huh? All this in a week? And why? After the British Royal Navy destroyed the French Mediterranean fleet at the Battle of the Nile in Egypt on August 1st of 1798, the British were able to initiate a blockade of Malta, assisted by an uprising of the native Maltese against French rule. The blockade effectively ended the French occupation of Malta in 1800 and replaced it with a British protectorate, returning control of the central Mediterranean to Great Britain. In the 1814 Treaty of Paris, Malta officially became part of the British Empire and was used as a shipping way station and fleet headquarters. When the Suez Canal opened in 1869, Malta was considered an important stop on the way to India, a central trade route for the British, because it was halfway between the Strait of Gibraltar and Egypt. Malta gained its independence from Britain in 1964. Napoleon proclaimed himself Emperor of France in 1804. Apparently, he was very interested in the part of Calabria, the region in the toe of the boot of Italy, that is across from Messina in Sicily, in the Strait of Messina. He made his older brother, Joseph Napoleon, the King of Naples and Sicily between 1806 and 1808, who we are told implemented administrative reforms in 1806 that abolished the ruling system that was in place there, and the lordship of Fiumara disappeared. We are told the union of the Kingdom of Denmark-Norway, also known as the Oldenburg Monarchy, existed as a dual monarchy between 1537 and 1814, with Copenhagen as its capital. The Oldenburg Monarchy had long remained neutral in the Napoleonic Wars. Britain was said to have feared that Napoleon would attempt to conquer the Danish-Norwegian naval fleet, and used that as a pretext to attack Copenhagen in what became known as the Siege of Copenhagen in August of 1807, and Britain seized the naval fleet in September of 1807. This also assured the use of the sea lanes in the North Sea and Baltic Sea for the British merchant fleet. The fleet robbery drew Denmark-Norway into the war on the side of Napoleon. Then in 1814, the Treaty of Kiel between the United Kingdom and Sweden on the anti-French side, and Norway and Denmark on the French side, dissolved the Oldenburg monarchy by transferring Norway to the King of Sweden, and the King of Denmark retained the Faroe Islands, Greenland, and Iceland. The Barbary Wars were a series of conflicts culminating in two main wars fought between the United States, Sweden, and the Barbary states of the Ottoman Empire in the late 18th and early 19th century. We are told that Barbary pirates demanded tribute from American vessels in the Mediterranean Sea, and in 1801, President Thomas Jefferson refused to pay and sent a U.S. naval fleet to the Mediterranean in May of that year, and which lasted until 1805. We are told the naval fleet commenced bombarding various fortified pirate cities in present-day Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria over the next 3 years until concessions of fair passage were extracted from their rulers, which were most likely the days of Tripoli, Tunis, and Algiers in the First Barbary War. The Second Barbary War took place in 1815 between the United States and the Barbary States, and we are told brought an end to the American practice of paying tribute to the pirate states and marked the beginning of the end of piracy in that region. I would love to know what is really going on here with regards to the Barbary Wars, but that information is nowhere to be found. The First Anglo-Afghan War was fought for 3 years between the British East India Company and the Emirate of Afghanistan, starting in 1839 after the British had successfully captured Kabul, and they capitalized on a succession dispute between a current and former emir there, at which time the British exiled the emir at the time, Dost Muhammad, and installed the former emir, Shah Shuja. When the main British forces occupying Kabul retreated in January of 1842, they were almost completely annihilated by the Afghani tribesmen. In retaliation, the British sent what was called an army of retribution to Kabul to avenge their defeat, and demolished parts of the city, recovered prisoners, and left Afghanistan, with the exiled Emir Dost Muhammad returning from India to Kabul. Destruction that was done in retaliation for people who were defending their own land from invading foreigners who wanted to take it. The First Anglo-Afghan War is called one of the first major conflicts of what was called the Great Game, the 19th century competition for power and influence in Central Asia between Britain and Russia. During World War I, the Strait of Dardanelles in Turkey was the location of the Gallipoli campaign, one of the bloodiest battles of the war. There were at least 24 forts in the Strait of Dardanelles, as they were numbered. The Gallipoli campaign took place between April 25th of 1915 and January 9th of 1916. A joint British and French operation was mounted to capture the Ottoman capital of Constantinople, known as Istanbul since 1923, and secure a sea route to Russia. The Ottomans were victorious at the end of this campaign. There were direct attacks on the star forts in the Strait of Dardanelles. They were bombarded and in many cases completely destroyed. For example, the Royal Navy bombarded the Sed al-Bahr fort on Cape Helles at the entrance to the straits at the beginning of the joint British and French amphibious invasion, which started on April 25th of 1915. And the fort at Kum Kali was on the opposite side of the entrance to the Strait of Dardanelles from Cape Helles. The Battle of Kum Kali was said to have also been fought on April 25th of 1915 between Ottoman defenders and French troops as a diversion from the main landings on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The fort at Kum Kali was completely destroyed by naval gunfire early in the operations. These are examples of some of the things that took place during World War II. Reza Shah Pahlavi was deposed in September of 1941 as a result of the British and Soviet invasion of Iran because he was seen as a German ally, even though Iran had maintained neutrality in the conflict, which took place purportedly to secure Iran's oil fields and the railroad used as a supply route for war material for the Soviet Union along what was called the Persian Corridor. The 865-mile or 1,392-kilometer Trans-Iranian Railroad was opened during the reign of Reza Shah Pahlavi in 1939. He was replaced as Shah by his young son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the last Shah of Iran, who was overthrown as head of state on February 11th of 1979, after which time the country became the Islamic Republic of Iran. In Valletta, the capital of Malta, there were many targets of aerial bombardment, starting on the first day Malta became involved in the conflict of World War II, on June 11th of 1940. These targets included Fort St. Elmo, Fort Ricasoli, and the Royal Opera House, which took a direct hit in April of 1942 from German Air Force bombers and was almost completely destroyed. The Royal Opera Theatre was said to have been designed by the English architect Edward Middleton Barry in 1866. And this is what it looks like today, which was developed into an open-air theater, which opened in August of 2013. On the same alignment as Malta in Tunisia, the Battle of Kasserine Pass took place during the Tunisia campaign of World War II. It was the first major engagement between American and Axis forces in Africa. With the Axis German and Italian forces led by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, it was an early defeat for Allied forces. In 1945, in the last months of World War II, the Battle of Manila brought destruction and havoc to the city of Manila and its rail infrastructure. The Manila Tranvías fleet was damaged beyond repair and abandoned immediately after the war. The rails were pulled up from the city streets, and surviving streetcars were hauled away and scrapped. This was the end of what had previously been considered one of the best street rail networks in Asia. The Grand Palais in Hanoi was also completely destroyed by airstrikes in 1945, at the end of the war. The reason given was that when the Japanese took over Vietnam in 1940, they based their military and supply there. The Grand Palais was said to have been built specifically for the Hanoi Exposition in 1902. We are told Sweden was successfully able to maintain its policy of neutrality during the entirety of World War II. Wow, great, right? Well, in Sweden's case, keeping its neutrality translated to allowing the Germans to transport the 163rd Infantry Division in 1941, along with heavy weapons, from Norway to Finland, allowing the German soldiers to use the railway when on leave between these two countries, and selling iron ore to Germany throughout the war. For the Allies, Sweden shared military intelligence and helped to train soldiers from Norway and Denmark to enable them to be used for the liberation of their home countries, and allowed the Allies to use Swedish air bases between 1944 and 1945. It sounds like Sweden's definition of neutrality was having no problem working for both sides. How different would World War II have been if Sweden, for example, hadn't allowed the Nazi Germans access to Finland, and thereby Russia, for troop and weapons transport? In the years between the Gulf of Tonkin incident, an international confrontation that led to the United States engaging more directly in the Vietnam War in August of 1964 and its end in 1975. The neighboring country in Southeast Asia of Laos had its own problems with the Vietnam War spilling over, with Laos being bombed by American planes starting in 1964, in retaliation, we are told, for the shooting down of an American plane by insurgents, and after which bombing runs over Laos intensified, with over 100,000 bombing runs on Laos's eastern border with North Vietnam. The plain of Jars in Laos was heavily bombed between 1964 and 1973 by the U.S. Air Force operating against the North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao communist forces, and it was said that the Air Force dropped more bombs on the plain of Jars than it dropped during the entirety of World War II. These were some unexploded bombs removed from the plain of Jars from the secret war in Laos. Why the incessant and excessive bombing of a megalithic archaeological site? Per capita, Laos is the most bombed country in history. Besides regime change and acquisition of whole empires, it sure looks to me like wars took place in order to damage and/or destroy, at the very least, the infrastructure of the ancient advanced Moorish civilization. The next area of research I would like to get into about how the New World was created from the Old World is the subject of conferences. The Congress of Vienna was said to be one of the most important international conferences in European history. It was a meeting of ambassadors of European states held in Vienna in Austria between 1814 and 1815 in order to remake Europe after the downfall of Napoleon. The stated goal was to resize the main powers so they could balance each other and in this way remain at peace, and not simply to restore old boundaries. As a result of the Congress of Vienna, France lost all of its recent conquests, while Prussia, Austria, and Russia made major territorial gains. Most of the discussions took place in informal face-to-face sessions among the ambassadors of Austria, Britain, France, Russia, and sometimes Prussia, with limited or no participation by other delegates. As such, the so-called Congress of Vienna never met in plenary session, which means a session in which all members of all parties are able to attend. The Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885 was organized by the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck in order to regulate European colonization and trade in Africa during the new imperialism period, and coincided with Germany's sudden appearance as an imperial power. The outcome of the General Act of the Berlin Conference can be seen as the formalization of the scramble for Africa, also known as the Partition of Africa or the Conquest of Africa, the invasion, occupation, and division of African territory by European powers during the new imperialism period between 1884 and 1914, the year in which World War I started. The period of history known as New Imperialism is characterized as a period of colonial expansion by European powers, the United States and Japan, during the late 1800s and early 1900s. Otto von Bismarck was the mastermind behind the unification of Germany in 1871 and served as its first chancellor until 1890. While on the one hand, he was said to have skillfully used balance of power diplomacy to maintain Germany's position for 20 years in a peaceful Europe. On the other hand, the way he unified Germany was by provoking 3 decisive wars with Denmark, Austria, and France, and by abolishing the supranational German Confederation, an association of 39 German-speaking states in Central Europe that was created by the Congress of Vienna to replace the former Holy Roman Empire, and formed the German Empire, which excluded Austria, which I remember was a factor which motivated the Austrian Adolf Hitler to develop his German nationalist ideology. He also annexed Alsace-Lorraine on the border with Germany, which was part of France, as a result of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 1871. We are told that France's determination to regain Alsace-Lorraine and fear of another Franco-German war, as well as British apprehension about the balance of power, became factors in the causes of World War I. The last subject of this video are how treaties were used to create the New World from the Old World. The Treaty of Utrecht, or Peace of Utrecht, was a series of what is described as peace treaties signed between April of 1713 and February of 1715 in the Dutch city of Utrecht by the belligerents in the War of Spanish Succession. The War of Spanish Succession came about, we are told, when the last Habsburg king of Spain, Charles II, died childless in 1700, and he named his grandnephew Philip of France as his successor in his last will, who became King Philip V of Spain in 1700. Philip was also the grandson of King Louis XIV of France, and also in line for the French throne. The other major powers in Europe were not willing to tolerate the potential union of these 2 powerful states. The Utrecht treaties allowed Philip to take the Spanish throne in return for permanently renouncing his claim to the French throne, and paved the way for the European system based on balance of power. As an extra step, Great Britain, France, and the Dutch Republic signed the Triple Alliance as a way to maintain the Treaties of Utrecht on January 4th of 1717. So as a result of all of this, in preventing the thrones of Spain and France from merging together, The way was ultimately paved for the maritime, commercial, and financial supremacy of Great Britain. The Treaty of Nanking, or Nanjing, between the British Empire and China was signed after China's defeat after the First Opium War in 1842. The First Opium War was fought between the Qing dynasty of China and Britain between 1839 and 1842, a military engagement that started when the Chinese seized opium stocks at Canton in order to stop the opium trade, which was banned. The British government insisted upon free trade and equality among nations and backed the merchants' demands. From 1757 to 1842, the Canton system served as a means for China to control trade with the West by focusing all trade in the southern port of Canton. To counter this, the British East India Company began to grow opium in Bengal, in present-day Bangladesh, and allowed private British merchants to sell opium to Chinese smugglers for illegal sale in China. As a result from these events in history, opium dens, establishments where opium was sold and smoked, became prevalent in many parts of the world throughout the 19th century. Interesting to note that the first British diplomatic mission to China, the Macartney mission, took place in 1793, only 50 years before the signing of the Treaty of Nanjing. The goals of the Macartney mission were to 1. Open new ports for British trade in China, 2. The establishment of a permanent embassy in what was then called Peking, now Beijing, 3. The cession of a small island off the coast of China for Britain's use, and 4. The relaxation of trade restrictions on British merchants in Canton in southern China. While it was said to have failed to achieve its objectives, the Macartney mission was noted for having brought back extensive cultural, political, and geographical observations that its participants recorded. Millard Fillmore was the vice president to President Zachary Taylor, who was said to have died of problems from something he ate several days after attending a July 4th celebration in 1850. So he became President Millard Fillmore in 1850. Commodore Matthew Perry played a leading role in the opening of Japan, starting on July 8th of 1853, when he led 4 U.S. Navy ships ordered by President Fillmore to Tokyo Bay, with the mission of forcing the opening of Japanese ports to American trade by any means necessary. After threatening to burn Tokyo to the ground, he was allowed to land and deliver a letter with United States demands to the Tokugawa shogun Ieyasu. The shogun Ieyasu died a short time after Perry's departure in July of 1853, leaving effective administration in the hands of the Council of Elders, though nominally to his sickly son Ieyasu, who was the Tokugawa shogun from 1853 to 1858, and was the last feudal Japanese military government. Perry returned again with 8 naval vessels in February of 1854, and on March 31st of 1854, the Japanese Emperor Komei signed the Japan and United States Treaty of Peace and Amity at the Convention of Kanagawa, under threat of force if the Japanese government did not open the ports of Shimoda and Hakodate to American vessels. Then there's the history we are taught about the Ionian Islands, or Heptanesi, a group of 7 main islands in the Ionian Sea off the west coast of Greece. I will start when the Ionian Islands were said to have become part of the Venetian Republic in 1500 AD, also known as La Serenissima, or Most Serene Republic of Venice, described as a sovereign state and a maritime republic. The Treaty of Campo Formio was signed by Napoleon Bonaparte and Count Philip von Cobenzzi as representatives of the French Republic and the Austrian monarchy, respectively, in 1797. This treaty disbanded and partitioned the Venetian Republic by the French and the Austrians, and the Ionian Islands were awarded to France. At that time, the Ionian Islands became the short-lived French department of Itaque, or Ithaca, as it fell to the Russians in 1798 and was officially ended in 1802. Between the years of 1800 and 1807, the Ionian Islands were known as the Septinsular Republic, under Russian and Ottoman rule after the Russian-Ottoman fleet defeated Napoleon. Then, in 1807, Napoleon signed two agreements in the town of Tilsit in what was Prussia in East Germany, one between Emperor Alexander I of Russia, and the second treaty was signed with Prussia, and the Ionian Islands were returned to France, becoming a French protectorate. Then, in 1809, the British blockaded the Ionian Islands as part of the war against Napoleon in September of that year, and hoisted the British flag on the island of Zakynthos, with Kefalonia and Ithaca soon surrendering. The British installed provisional governments here. The Treaty of Paris of 1815 recognized the United States of the Ionian Islands and established them as a British protectorate. Then, in 1864, the Ionian Islands were transferred back to Greece to become a full member of the Greek state when the British-backed Prince William of Denmark became King George I of the Hellenes in 1863. When King George was nearing the 50th year of his reign, he was assassinated in 1913 in Thessaloniki, near the White Tower, by a socialist named Alexandros Skinas, who said, when he was arrested, that he killed the king because the king had refused to give him money. I think the truth of the matter is that all of these players were actually working towards the same goal of taking down the old world order, taking its wealth, faking the historical narrative to exclude the original civilization, and establishing the conditions for what we see happening in the world today. Earth's people and grid system were deliberately hijacked by dark beings with a negative agenda, who definitely don't want us to wake up to our true history and who we really are, and have worked hard to keep this from happening. I have come to believe through my research that a worldwide liquefaction event was deliberately created, and that the original ancient advanced civilization was wiped out, erased from our collective memory, and a new historical narrative was created based on the underpinnings of the original civilization, but original meanings and intents were twisted and subverted in order to create a system of control for humanity. It is important for me to note that at first I thought, with all of the detailed history of India, for example, in the historical narrative we are given, that it wasn't mud-flooded and had to be taken down by other means. Then in doing research through India, I found these pictures. This is a picture of the Qutub Shahi tombs from the Golconda Fort in Hyderabad, India, circa 1902 or 1903. And this photo was said to be of Kuldabad Rest House near the Ellora Caves in India, circa 1890. In this series, I have to share what the narrative we are given has to say about our history, because there is no other written information to explain otherwise. In the second part of this series, I'm going to be looking at how papal bulls, Jesuits, and other religious orders, colonization, and place name changes were employed to create the New World from the Old World.